It took exactly 47 seconds for the meticulous, 30-year career of Deputy FBI Director Samir Patel to disintegrate. 4 to 7 seconds of silence, a slow blink, and the precise, clinical mention of a specific brokerage account. The stakes were no longer about policy. They were about the Constitution, fiduciary duty, and the invisible line between public service and personal enrichment. The cavernous, high-ceiling hearing room of the Senate Judiciary Committee was a carefully crafted set piece for consequence. Polished mahogany tables reflected the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights above, casting a shallow, yellowed glow that seemed to drain the color from the air. This was not a place for passion, but for the forensic dissection of power. The room's architecture, marble columns, heavy velvet curtains, and the elevated dais where the senators presided, was designed to remind every witness of the institutional permanence that stood against their individual temporary authority. Deputy Director Patel, a man whose career had been defined by controlled calculation and administrative discipline, sat isolated at the witness table. His suit was dark, perfectly tailored, yet it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A single glass of water stood before him, untouched, condensation slowly forming a small, dark ring on the beige blotter paper. The atmosphere was a taut wire of contained hostility. On the dais, the Judiciary Committee members were arranged like judges, some reading notes with studied disinterest, others leaning forward with the hunter's focus. The proceedings were nominally about the Bureau's implementation of the previous year's appropriations, specifically, the allocation of funds for the expansion of counterintelligence oversight under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, but the political undercurrent was palpable. The committee, led by Senator Neguse, Democrat Colorado, a relentless cross-examiner with a quiet, analytical approach, had spent months reviewing thousands of pages of financial disclosures. Neguse leaned into the static-filled microphone, his voice calm, almost conversational, betraying none of the internal rigor applied to the data before him. Director Patel, thank you for appearing. I appreciate the Bureau's cooperation in providing the revised quarterly budgetary review. Before we move to the specifics of the $4.8 million allocation for automated threat assessment systems, I want to clarify a point on internal administrative overhead. Could you confirm for the record the specific compliance protocols applied to the financial oversight of non-public materials generated by the Economic Crimes Unit? This would fall under Section 3A of the FBI Personnel Ethics Directive, correct? Patel cleared his throat, the sound magnified and unnatural in the silence. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements minimal, rehearsed. That is correct, Senator. Section 3A dictates mandatory quarterly review by the Office of Professional Responsibility, focusing explicitly on access logs and information dissemination, particularly concerning market-sensitive intelligence. We maintain zero tolerance for the improper use of classified or even pre-public information. This includes all derivatives of the National Security Act's protection requirements. He spoke with the familiar, authoritative cadence of a high-level administrator. The answer was technically flawless, a defensive shield of policy jargon. A cameraman adjusted his lens. The red record light was an invasive, persistent pinprick in the periphery. Neguse nodded slowly, making a quick, precise note on a yellow legal pad. The motion was small, but deliberate. The line of questioning felt procedural, tedious even, designed to lull the witness into a sense of mundane safety. But to those watching closely, the legal counsel, the analysts in the back rows, the focus on ethics and market-sensitive intelligence was the first subtle tremor before the earthquake. Patel shifted his weight, his gaze momentarily flicking to the ceiling, a brief, imperceptible break in composure that only the most dedicated investigator would spot. He had answered the policy question perfectly. But the policy wasn't the target. But the real question hadn't even been asked yet. Senator Neguse allowed a carefully timed silence to settle after Patel's robust defense of the Bureau's ethics directives. The quiet was heavy, punctuated only by the low, continuous whir of the air conditioning and the rhythmic, soft clicking of keyboards from the committee staff section. Neguse did not rush. He took a sip of water, allowing the procedural tension to mount. The strategy was clear. Anchor the witness to the highest possible standard of administrative law before revealing the deviation. Thank you, Director Patel. The commitment to Section 3A is laudable, Neguse continued, his voice maintaining its neutral, journalistic rhythm. Let us then turn to the practical application of that commitment, specifically concerning disclosures. As you know, the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, as amended, mandates that certain senior officials must file public financial disclosure reports, the SF 278, detailing all financial holdings and transactions exceeding $1,000. For an individual in your role, with access to intelligence that could move markets, whether it be in infrastructure vulnerabilities, energy policy shifts, or major corporate fraud investigations, this is not merely a bureaucratic requirement. It is the constitutional mechanism for insulating the state from corruption. Would you agree that strict, timely compliance with the SF 278 filing requirements is the bedrock of public trust for any deputy director? Patel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew this line of questioning was a trap, yet he was bound by protocol to uphold the legal premise. I agree completely, Senator. Full disclosure is a non-negotiable term of employment, an extension of our oath to the Constitution. Furthermore, Bureau policy requires that transactions of high-level officials that involve market-sensitive sectors be pre-cleared by the OPR legal counsel. He made a point of looking directly at Neguse, projecting confidence, but the controlled intensity in his eyes signaled defensiveness. Neguse pressed a small button on his microphone base, triggering a chime for a legal question. Very well. Director, in your most recent public SF 278, filed on June 30th of this year, you reported liquid assets totaling approximately $1 million, primarily held in managed funds. However, my staff noted the omission of several transactions occurring in the previous fiscal quarter. Specifically, on March 14th, a trade was executed in an account under the name Patel S., involving the purchase of 4,000 shares of a small-cap infrastructure company, Aegis Corporation. The investment totaled exactly $100,560. This transaction does not appear on the June 30th SF 278. Can you explain that omission? The room temperature seemed to drop. Patel's composure fractured for the first time. His left hand, resting on the mahogany, tightened into a loose fist, his knuckles turning white. He swallowed hard. The mention of the exact dollar amount and the specific company name transformed the atmosphere from an administrative review into a targeted investigation. This was no fishing expedition. Senator, I believe you are referencing a legacy account, one I share with a family member. It is a managed account. My understanding, based on legal counsel, was that transactions below a certain reporting threshold, particularly those managed passively, did not require immediate itemization on the public SF 278, provided the aggregate value was included. I included the aggregate value. His voice was slightly thinner, the authoritative resonance diminished. Let's clarify, Director. Neguse countered, leaning in, his tone hardening just a shade. First, what is the Bureau's reporting threshold for actively managed accounts involving senior officials? And does that supersede the requirements of the Ethics in Government Act? Second, can you definitively state that this Aegis Corp purchase, totaling over $100,000, was made passively and was not pre-cleared by OPR legal counsel? Yes or no, Director? The questions were short, sharp, and legally precise, dismantling his defensive jargon. Patel avoided the yes or no. The transaction was executed by the portfolio manager, Senator. And the account. He paused, his gaze dropping to the water glass before him. The silence stretched, a heavy, audible thing. This transaction was not a clerical error. It was the crack in the foundation. But the senator had not yet revealed the real connection. Senator Neguse allowed Patel's evasiveness to hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of the unanswered question press down on the witness. The digital clock on the back wall of the chamber ticked visibly, audibly, a relentless countdown. The Bureau's policy, Director Patel, does not supersede federal law. The Ethics in Government Act requires itemized reporting of transactions over $1,000 for senior officials, regardless of whether the account is managed or legacy. The failure to disclose a $100,000 equity purchase is not an administrative oversight. It is a direct violation of the reporting requirements for an SF-278 filer, Neguse stated, his voice now carrying a sharp, factual edge. He paused, then introduced the critical piece of evidence. But the failure to disclose is not the primary issue here, Director. The primary issue is the conflict of interest inherent in the trade itself. Neguse pulled a single sheet of paper from a large, confidential binder and submitted it to the committee clerk. Director Patel, I draw your attention to a document filed with the Oversight Committee, marked Exhibit C. This is an internal FBI memo dated March 10th of this year, 4 days prior to your $100,560 purchase of Aegis Corp stock. Patel's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the title of the memo, Operation Infrastructure Shield, Phase 1 Assessments. He shifted uncontrollably in his chair, the movement loud against the microphone. This was the moment the legal framework tightened into a vice. Neguse continued, his voice precise. This memo, which you authored and circulated only to top-tier bureau leadership, details a critical vulnerability assessment of U.S. infrastructure. Specifically, Section 4.2 identifies Aegis Corp., a private sector contractor specializing in secure logistics software for municipal water systems, as a potential target for state-sponsored cyber exploitation. The memo concludes with a high-priority recommendation for the Department of Homeland Security to issue an immediate, highly lucrative, and non-competitive emergency contract to a third-party vendor capable of remediation. This assessment, based on sensitive intelligence, would inevitably cause the stock of Aegis Corp to plummet due to the exposure of its systemic failure. Neguse then delivered the legal hammer blow. Director Patel, 4 days after you co-signed a memo detailing a massive vulnerability that would destroy the value of Aegis Corp., an account bearing your name bought over $100,000 of its stock. This is not a clerical error. This looks like a preemptive short-term gamble on market intelligence known only to a handful of people in the government. This is a direct, clear-cut violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 208, Acts Affecting a Personal Financial Interest, which criminalizes a federal official participating in any matter that directly affects their own financial interest. Patel's throat worked, his carefully constructed composure evaporating under the weight of the facts. He reached for the glass of water, his hand shaking slightly, causing the ice to rattle. Senator, that memo was about vulnerability. The purchase was made 4 days later by a portfolio manager who was executing a trade that gambled against the inevitable market reaction to a national security threat that only you and 5 other individuals knew about. Neguse interrupted, his tone escalating only through the sheer force of factual chronology. Director, we have subpoenaed the trading records. The brokerage house shows a specific instruction placed by the account holder, not the manager, on March 13th to purchase and hold Aegis Corporation. You are exposed not just to a civil penalty under the Stock Act, but potentially to criminal charges for exploiting market-sensitive national security information for personal gain. Your failure here is twofold: an administrative failure to disclose the purchase, and a constitutional failure to uphold your duty by potentially profiting from national security intelligence. The camera flashes began, small, bright explosions of light that illuminated the beads of sweat forming on Patel's brow. The revelation had achieved its intended effect. The room was no longer silent. It was buzzing with a collective, horrified gasp. But the most devastating part of the sequence was yet to come. The revelation of the trading instruction, placed by the account holder, not the fund manager, shattered the last remnants of Deputy Director Patel's defense. The high-powered lights of the hearing room suddenly seemed blinding, unforgiving. Patel was trapped, not by aggressive rhetoric, but by the cold, undeniable linkage between the internal FBI memo dated March 10th and the stock purchase instruction on March 13th. Senator Neguse leaned back, his expression a mask of disappointment rather than triumph. He delivered the final questions with the measured solemnity of a judge delivering a fatal verdict. Director Patel, let us return to the Aegis Corporation purchase. 4 days after your memo identifying a severe vulnerability, and 1 day before the market-moving event became public, you, or an individual acting under your direct instruction for your benefit, bought the stock. The only way to profit on this specific timeline was to know, with absolute certainty, that the Bureau's classified intelligence had not leaked, but that the subsequent government intervention, the non-competitive contract, would save the company's stock before the vulnerability assessment could be processed by the public market. He paused, letting the legal deduction sink in. This means you were essentially trading on your knowledge of government action, predicated on classified intelligence, and specifically betting on the speed of the federal response. Director, what is the core tenet of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment as it relates to government accountability? Patel struggled to articulate an answer, his face pale, the years of institutional control failing him. His eyes darted desperately, scanning the room for any signal from his accompanying counsel, who sat stiffly, unable to intervene in the committee's Q&A format. He knew the answer. The government must act fairly and in accordance with established law, ensuring no individual receives an unfair advantage. Patel finally managed, his voice a dry whisper, "It ensures fair treatment, equal protection. It ensures, Director, that the power of the state is not used arbitrarily, and certainly not for the private, personal benefit of its officers." Neguse finished for him, his tone now rising slightly, sharp and authoritative. "Your actions constitute a breach of this clause because you used the power of the FBI, and the confidential information generated by its counterintelligence operations, as a guaranteed financial instrument for personal profit. You failed the public duty inherent in your office." Then came the precise sequence of the collapse, the 47-second moment captured by every microphone and lens. Patel's right hand, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble uncontrollably, vibrating the static microphone slightly. He attempted to pull the memo toward him, but the motion was clumsy, frantic. He lost the thread completely. "Senator, the Bureau's work is rigorous. I refute the premise that this was anything but a timing error in the disclosure, a failure of aggregation by the broker." He stammered, the polished veneer gone, replaced by raw desperation. Neguse cut through the noise, holding up a printout of the brokerage ticket. "Director, we have the record. The purchase was executed at 11:14 a.m. on March 14th. That morning, you received a briefing that finalized the remedial contract details. This transaction is the textual embodiment of insider trading using classified intelligence. You violated the explicit prohibitions of the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, Stock Act, which extends to the executive branch. Your legal ignorance, or your deliberate disregard for the law, is fatal. By trading on non-public information concerning a national security contract derived from an active FBI investigation, you have violated not only administrative ethics but committed a felony under the umbrella of federal securities fraud and the exploitation of classified information. The time check on the committee monitor showed the exchange lasted exactly 47 seconds from the moment Patel attempted to grab the memo to Neguse's final sentence. It was the moment the character lost control, and the legal facts, laid bare and undeniable, exposed the core institutional failure, the breach of the Fifth Amendment's promise of equal treatment under the law. Patel leaned back, defeated, his face drained of color, his defense silenced by the weight of the evidence. The witness remained seated, but his career had already fallen. The political earthquake registered instantaneously across the nation's media landscape. Within minutes of Senator Neguse's final, damning assertion and Deputy Director Patel's visible collapse, the footage was clipped, analyzed, and played on an endless loop. The carefully controlled environment of the Senate hearing room had ruptured, broadcasting a deep institutional wound into the public consciousness. The political commentary was swift, clinical, and devastating. On CNN, legal analyst and former Deputy Attorney General, Ilara Vance, offered a grave assessment. This is not simply an ethical violation. This is a breach of the fundamental social contract. Constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate. Patel wasn't just trading on insider information. He was trading on his knowledge of the government's reaction to classified national security threats. That elevates the crime from securities fraud to a profound betrayal of public trust under 18 U.S. Code Chapter 115, potentially relating to conflicts of interest and improper handling of official information. Across the spectrum, the consensus was one of shock and institutional fatigue. Fox News anchor Michael Thorne framed the failure as a collapse of the administrative state's competence. For 47 seconds, America watched competence collapse. The FBI is designed to hold the nation's most sensitive secrets, yet its deputy director leveraged that very sensitivity for a quick personal profit. The political consequences are immediate. The director of the FBI must resign. The DOJ must launch a special counsel investigation. This single act undermines every pending prosecution and every national security briefing the Bureau provides. The institutional consequences materialized within the hour. By 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the White House press secretary issued a terse, two-sentence statement announcing that Deputy Director Samir Patel had been placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a joint Department of Justice and Office of Professional Responsibility review. The language was deliberately cold, signaling a complete lack of presidential defense. The market reaction, though secondary to the legal and political turmoil, was also immediate. Aegis Corp stock, whose value had briefly been inflated by the non-competitive contract, suffered a rapid, catastrophic correction as the details of the intelligence failure and Patel's alleged manipulation became intertwined with the firm's public perception. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, immediately halted trading on the firm and issued a wide-ranging subpoena. The fallout was felt most acutely on Capitol Hill. The political capital of the entire Justice Department evaporated overnight. Bipartisan calls for comprehensive reform of the Ethics in Government Act began to dominate the news cycle, demanding greater transparency, harsher penalties, and a complete ban on individual stock ownership for officials holding sensitive security clearances. The scandal forced an immediate, emergency closed-door session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, with key senators demanding answers on how the FBI's own internal financial oversight mechanisms, the very ones Patel had defended in Chapter 2, failed to flag the transactions before the public hearing. The crisis of confidence was absolute. A deputy director's personal greed had not just ended his career, it had weaponized the American legal and political system against itself, demonstrating a staggering vulnerability at the highest echelon of law enforcement. But the price of such betrayal always extends beyond the individual. The finality of the aftermath descended with a quiet, devastating certainty. The spectacle of the hearing gave way to the slow, relentless machinery of institutional justice. The marble halls of the Department of Justice, usually humming with contained activity, felt heavier, weighed down by the immediate need for a public cleansing. Deputy Director Patel was not merely fired, he was effectively erased. His name was scrubbed from current organizational charts, and his decades of service were distilled into a single, ignominious date, March 14th, the day of the trade. The moral failure at the heart of the scandal was not the size of the profit, which, by Wall Street standards, was modest at just over $100,000, but the abuse of the Constitution's implied trust. The entire framework of executive power relies on the good faith and fidelity of its officers. When a senior official, entrusted with protecting the nation's security from threats both foreign and domestic, weaponizes that very intelligence for personal gain, the injury extends past a mere breach of ethics and becomes a philosophical assault on the Republic. The legal community's reflection centered on the concept of fiduciary duty. While a deputy director doesn't owe a direct fiduciary duty to shareholders, he owes an unassailable duty of loyalty and fidelity to the office and the American people. Patel's actions demonstrated an absolute prioritization of self-interest over the mission of the FBI and the integrity of the state. His failure was not a mistake of law but a failure of moral character, a disregard for the sacred nature of the oath he took. The specific violation of the Stock Act and 18 U.S. Code Section 208 merely provided the legal mechanism for accountability. The deeper issue was the ethical void exposed at the top. Months later, the Senate Judiciary Committee issued its final, damning report, titled The Breach of Trust, Intelligence and Private Gain. It did not linger on Patel's downfall but focused on necessary reforms, mandatory divestiture of individual stocks for all senior intelligence officials, creation of a fully independent ethics compliance office within the DOJ, and the immediate enforcement of the Administrative Procedures Act, APA, to standardize and aggressively audit financial disclosures. The incident became a case study, a cold, clinical example of how easily a powerful system can be compromised from within by simple, personal greed. Patel himself was never seen again in the public sphere. He would eventually face civil penalties and potentially criminal charges, but his public execution had already taken place on the floor of the Senate. His silence in the face of the final, devastating question, the 47-second collapse, was the definitive answer to his career. He was a symbol now, not a man. His legacy was defined by the gap between the ideals of the office and the realities of human fallibility. The city of Washington, D.C. moved on, the scandal absorbed into its cyclical metabolism of power, failure, and replacement. The high mahogany table was polished, the chair was refilled. Some careers end in scandal. His ended in silence.